Okay. Um, Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Matthew Punamali, and I am a senior environmental scientist with the Environmental Compliance Unit of the Off-Road or Off-Highway Motor Vehicle Recreation Division. Today's presentation marks an exciting and important milestone for Oceano Dunes State Vehicular Recreation Area and the OHMVR division, as it's another step towards ensuring compliance with the updated environmental requirements of Senate Bill 249. The purpose of this presentation is to introduce you all to the Oceano Dunes Wildlife Habitat Protection Plan, or WIP as we like to say. This presentation will be recorded and posted for later viewing if you ever need to go back and reference it. Additionally, at the end of the presentation, we'll be able to answer questions which you may have about the document. Until that time, please keep your microphones muted. And at the end of the presentation, if you have a question, please use the raise hand feature and wait for park staff to call upon you. On behalf of our entire team, thank you very much for your interest in this presentation, and we look forward to your feedback. Today's presentation will take place in two parts. First, I will be providing some background information on the WIPs, starting with a discussion of the WIP requirements, both past and present, Senate Bill 249 and the changes it made to the OHMVR division and the department, the division's process for updating and developing the WIPs, the details of the public review period, and finally, the progress we have made to date. Following my slides, I'll turn over the presentation to Oceano Dunes SVRA staff so they can take you through their document. So we'll start at the highest level, as it's important to understand the requirement for the Wildlife Habitat Protection Plan and how it has changed. Nearly 40 years ago, the California legislature passed Senate Bill 877, which introduced the requirement to draft a wildlife habitat protection plan that sustained viable species composition at the SVRAs. And this was again reiterated in 2007 with Senate Bill 742. So you can see the WIPs have already been around for many years at this point. In 2017, Senate Bill 249 revised portions of the Public Resources Code, and one of those revisions required SVRAs to draft WIPs that conserve and improve wildlife habitats. This change in emphasis, among other statute amendments, prompted the need to update the SVRA WIPs. In a moment, we'll take a deeper look at some of the specific requirements of the WIPs. Senate Bill 249 made several changes and additions to the specific requirements and clarified the roles of the division and the department. First, the bill broadly aligned the division within the department to ensure consistency with the transformation effort which was occurring at the time. Through transformation, the SRAs began reporting through district chain of command. Senate Bill 249 requires the OHMVR division to prepare and implement WIPs at the SVRAs to ensure monitoring for WIP compliance occurs, to compile an inventory of native plant communities, and also requires that WIPs and their annual reports be posted on the division's webpage. Senate Bill 249 references the department in many of its updated statutes. Yes. Sorry, was someone... I thought I heard someone from my division.
Echo, but you're okay.
Okay. Sorry about that. Senate Bill 249 references the department in many of its updated statutes. Given that the WIPs focus on natural resources, the OHMVR division works closely with the Natural Resources Division of State Parks, who fulfills the requirements of the department as read in statute. Among other requirements, the bill tasks NRD with ensuring the WIPs apply best available science and that the WIPs provide opportunity for public comment. As I mentioned previously, there are several specific requirements that must be included in each of the SVRA's WIPs. To ensure that the WIPs fit within the context of regional conservation efforts, each WIP must be developed in consideration of state and regional conservation objectives where they are relevant. The overarching goal of each WIP is to conserve and improve habitat. This is accomplished by broadly defining conservation and improvement goals and then creating more specific objectives to reach those goals. Each WIP must also contain an updated inventory of native plant communities and wildlife found within the SVRA. The SVRA staff draw upon many resources to develop these inventories, including database searches and the last decade worth of monitoring, which has occurred at the SVRA. Next, each WIP must describe the monitoring that will ensure the efficacy of the management actions being implemented. These monitoring results drive the adaptive management feedback loop, which allows SVRAs to confirm their actions are meeting goals and adapt when they are not. Each WIP must also apply the principles of best available science throughout its development. And this goes beyond just picking specific monitoring methodologies. This requirement raises the rigor in which the plans are prepared. The Natural Resources Division developed the best available science guidelines for the department to ensure that there is a defined standard for the SVRAs to refer to. The objective of the best available science guidelines is to ensure that the natural resource related work at the department that the department engages in is carried out in an informed, transparent, and in an adaptive manner that allows for learning and anticipates changing conditions. Finally, each WIP must provide opportunities for public comment. Today's presentation is a part of our effort to reach as broad an audience as possible and to help inform the public about the document and the work which has gone into it. Each SVRA WIP is written to capture the entirety of the SVRA's resource management program. All WIPs are grounded in the adaptive management framework, and SVRA staff write each WIP to contain the following sections: the natural resource assessment, the resource management goals and objectives, the management actions, and the monitoring programs. Oceano Dunes staff will be touching on each of these portions of the WIP in the second part of the presentation, but ultimately you can think of this document as the means to protecting the SVRA's natural resources and to ensure that the beautiful places we recreate remain beautiful. As for the WIP development, after SB 249 passed, the OHMVR division and NRD began meeting with SVRA staff to build the WIP framework. The WIP framework describes the contents of the revised WIP and provide guidance to SVRA staff or SVRA authors to develop a WIP that would ultimately be compliant with statute. Once the framework was completed, headquarters staff began meeting with SVRA staff to develop their draft WIP, which is ultimately reviewed internally by multiple different parties. This draft then moves to the public review period, which is the stage that Oceano's WIP is at now. Following the public comment period and any changes that are implemented as a result of it, the WIP is finalized and reviewed by NRD for a best available science determination. After that, the OHMVR division approves the document and the SVRA can begin to implement the WIP. Once implementation has begun, annual reports are then compiled on a yearly basis and sent to headquarters staff for review. These reports are then posted on the division's website. Finally, it's important to note that we view these documents as living documents. They're to be reviewed annually and then updated a minimum of every 5 years. As I mentioned, this presentation is part of the public review period for Oceano Dunes draft WIP. When a WIP prepares for public review and comment, we send out an announcement about 2 weeks in advance. This announcement is distributed to a list of stakeholders put together both by SVRA staff and OHMVR division, as well as posted on social media in an attempt to reach also the recreating public. This draft WIP will be available for 32 days. The extra 2 days are to account for the upcoming Thanksgiving holiday. So the review period is starting today, November 20th, and will conclude on December 22nd. Once reviewed, any comments from the public should be sent to our dedicated email address, which you can see on the screen now, and which will be on the screen again and towards the end of the presentation. Park staff will compile all these comments into a tracking log where they will then be reviewed. And then how they are or are not addressed will be recorded in the document. Of the 9 SVRAs, 3, Prairie City, Heber Dunes, and Clay Pit, have had their WIPs finalized already. Another 4, Hollister Hills, Hungry Valley, Onyx Ranch, and then, of course, Oceano Dunes, are nearing, or have just finished their public review period and are aiming for finalization in the coming months. And the final 2 SVRAs, Carnegie and Ocotillo Wells, are anticipated to be finalized in 2025. Lastly, before I turn this over to Oceano Dunes staff, I want to take a second to acknowledge the hard work that has been done by park staff throughout the whole process. Specifically, Ron Melser with NRD for his work on the best available science guidelines, his staff, Leah Gardner and Melissa Patton, for their work on Veg Camp, my colleagues within the Environmental Compliance Unit for not only setting up this meeting, but also reviewing the draft WIPs as we're working on them. And then, of course, we cannot forget the Oceano Dunes staff you are about to hear from, who have worked tirelessly putting together this document. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the Resource Program Manager for the Oceano Dunes District, Ronnie Glick.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ronnie Glick. I'm a senior environmental scientist here at the Oceano Dunes District, and I have been here for almost 19 years overseeing the environmental programs, including earlier versions of our habitat management system program and now this new WIP. I want to start off by saying that the land that we are talking about is part of the unceded territory of the Yaktichu-Techu-Yaktalini Northern Chumash tribe. They have exhibited many thousands of years of careful stewardship of this land, and of course we hope to continue those efforts through our management of the land and the resources within this land. Before we get started, I think it's always good to talk to the group about the difference between the different programs that we have in place. And in particular, I want to share the difference of this WIP between our WIP and our habitat conservation plan. Our Habitat Conservation Plan has been a document that's been in the works for many years to cover impacts from ongoing activities to state and federally listed plants and animals. Those 6 plants and animals also are covered by our WIP, and there are even specific goals and objectives for some of those key species. But the WIP is really our effort to comply with a different regulation, to comply with the Public Resources Code, whereas our Habitat Conservation Plan is intended to apply to the species that are listed under the Federal Endangered Species Act. So while there is some overlap, these are really distinct processes and very different programs. I also want to stress that along with our habitat conservation plan and many of the other things we do, this WIP is really part of a comprehensive workload that we undertake in order to manage these lands for continued public access and recreation. We do these projects to sustain OHV use within these state park lands. Next slide, please. So the Oceano Dunes District is located in the southern part of San Luis Obispo County. We manage approximately 5,000 acres, including Pismo State Beach and the Oceano Dunes State Vehicular Recreation Area. We are one of the smallest districts in the state park system and one of 9 SVRAs managed or operated by the Off-Highway Motor Vehicle Recreation Division. This WIP includes land that is both within Oceano Dunes SVRA and Pismo State Beach. And the reason is Pismo State Beach and Oceano Dunes SVRA are managed side by side, contiguously, and access into the SVRA must necessarily cross lands within Pismo State Beach. Next slide, please. Oceano Dunes SVRA consists of approximately 3,600 acres. That is the area that's outlined in purple in these 2 images. About a quarter of that acreage is open to OHV activity, and those are the areas that are in orange in those images. We are the only public coastal site in the state park system where vehicles are permitted to drive on the beach and the public is allowed to camp directly on the beach. We are part of an extensive dune system called the Guadalupe-Nipomo Dune System, which includes multiple private and public lands. The land immediately to the south of ours is a national wildlife refuge, the Guadalupe-Nipomo Dunes National Wildlife Refuge. Next slide, please. We are truly a multi-use park, as you can see by the montage of pictures. We have a lot of activities that exist in Oceano Dunes and Pismo State Beach that happen side by side. It's a popular place for water sports, fishing, horseback riding, birding, and I think there is a remarkable balance of coastal access and conservation alongside OHV recreation and beach camping. We really have a lot going on here, and we're really proud to be able to continue to provide this diverse level of recreation. I have the pleasure now of introducing two of my staff who were instrumental in preparing this WIP. They share a combined 30 years of professional experience within the state park system and within these two state park units specifically, implementing natural resource conservation projects. They are some of the most dedicated and talented employees in the state park system, and that is saying a lot. But these are really, really outstanding individuals. I'm pleased to introduce Senior Environmental Scientist Ben Wagner and Senior Environmental Scientist Stephanie Little, who will present the remainder of this presentation.
Thank you, Ronnie. That was very kind. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Stephanie Little. I've been working at Oceano Dunes for the past 20 years. I started my career with state parks as a park aide, working with the Snowy Plover and Lease Term program. And now I help oversee the wildlife habitat protection plan that Ben and I will be talking about this evening. This revised plan builds on nearly 30 years of monitoring and management work that's taken place at Oceano Dunes. I think most of you know our district has some pretty incredible natural and cultural resources, and we're trying to balance the unique recreational opportunities that we have here while keeping those resources protected. Next slide. So our Wildlife Habitat Protection Plan, or WIP for short, has really evolved over the past 30 years. This revision now meets the latest legislative requirements, and will continue to be the management and monitoring plan that guides our work. So this evening, Ben and I will be highlighting chapters 2 through 6 and giving an overview of what each of these chapters entail. Next slide. So starting with chapter 2, this chapter talks about our management units and our natural resource assessments. These two combined are the foundation of our WIP. I'll describe each of these now. Next slide. So first, starting with management units. These units provide a structure for how and where we implement our monitoring and management efforts. We came up with 8 distinct units that were delineated based on land use type, watersheds, or areas where we have sensitive species. So for example, the Vegetated Islands Management Unit, which is colored turquoise, those are pockets of dune scrub and willow vegetation within the open riding area management unit. And these vegetated islands are fenced and they're closed to vehicles. And they also have some unique monitoring and management goals that Ben will talk about when we get to chapter 3. Next slide. So another management unit I wanted to highlight is the Arroyo Grande Creek Management Unit, seen in purple. This is our smallest management unit in the park at 29 acres. Arroyo Grande Creek flows seasonally into the Pacific Ocean and establishes a lagoon that we close to vehicles in order to protect sensitive habitat for species like tidewater goby and California red-legged frog. This is where I spend a lot of my time when I'm in the field doing surveys. I'll give additional details about the monitoring that we do here when we get to chapter 3. Next slide. So second part of chapter 2 talks about our natural resource assessments. This includes our wildlife and plant inventories. Creating these 2 inventories was also part of the legislative requirements. Our inventories were sourced from previous monitoring work. It basically includes every plant and animal that's been documented during our field surveys over the past 30 years. We also looked at databases like eBird and California Natural Diversity Database to include sightings from park visitors or researchers. So what's the significance of these inventories? As resource managers, knowing the listing status of every species in our park, its general habitat, its potential to occur, really helped us determine where we wanted to focus our conservation and improvement goals that we will be discussing in Chapter 3. And by the way, this is a slide that includes photos of some of the plant and animal species we have at Oceano Dunes. You can find more information about these species and every other species we've documented in the park in our wildlife inventory found in the appendix of our WIP. Next slide. So I mentioned we've been doing field surveys for the past 30 years as part of the WIP. These surveys have focused on long-term trends of birds, reptiles and amphibians, mammals, fish, vegetation. We also have many species that are federally or state listed, which have more involved monitoring protocols. We're always trying to improve our study designs and survey methods to stay current with best available science. So we often find ourselves collaborating with our colleagues and peers at Cal Poly, Point Blue, Institute for Bird Populations, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and California Native Plant Society. There's also been a lot of involvement over the years from our colleagues at the Natural Resource and OHV Division. We have come a long way since I first started here 20 years ago, and I really feel like we've come to a point where our WIP is truly scientifically defensible. Next slide. So I want to highlight what's been documented over the past 30 years to kind of brag and show how diverse this park is. In our district of 5,000 acres, we've documented 326 plant species, which is pretty remarkable considering how much sand we have in the dunes. We've also documented more than 300 species of birds, 19 species of reptiles and amphibians, 35 species of fish, 33 species of mammals, including my favorites, the bear, mountain lion, bobcat, and even badger. Next slide. So I just mentioned we have 33 species of mammals. 10 of those species were documented during a small mammal study we've been doing with Cal Poly for the last 7 years. We've been able to demonstrate through this study that off-highway vehicle recreation is not having an impact on our small mammal populations. We've also been able to show that conservation and improvement of certain habitats increases small mammal abundance and diversity. Conservation and improvement is a major theme and legislative requirement of our WIP, so you're going to hear those two words again. Our small mammal program was recently modified and improved based on best available science. We've sort of transitioned away from live trapping, which is what you're seeing in these photos, and we are now camera trapping, which is less labor intensive. We use artificial intelligence and a specially designed computer program, which expedites image processing and analysis of our small mammal data. You can find more information about this study in the WIP. And then I wanted to point out a few of our resident mammals, which are shown in these photos. We have a wood rat and a kangaroo rat on the bottom right. We have a deer mouse on the upper left. These species are found within the coastal dune, scrub, and willow habitat found on our vegetated islands management unit. Okay, so next slide. We also monitor the status of native fish that occupy the creeks, lakes, and coastal estuaries within our park. We've been doing quarterly fish surveys since 2003 and have detected, as I mentioned, 35 species of fish. I'll refer to these fish surveys again when I talk about the Rio Grande Creek Management Unit. Next slide. And then another program I wanted to highlight is our well-known Snowy Plover and California Least Tern program. This is a collection of our photos sort of showing some of the things we do within our Southern Exclosure Management Unit to accommodate Snowy Plover and Least Tern nesting. We do things like fence our exclosure to keep predators and visitors out. We do habitat enhancement using wood chips that mimic debris patches that the plovers and terns like to nest in. And we also have an extensive banding program where we're able to track their survival. We consistently have good breeding results. We continue to contribute to the recovery of these two species. It really is an impressive program. So I just talked about a few of our wildlife programs. Now I'm going to pass it off to Ben. He oversees our plant mapping and monitoring program that's associated with our WIP. Next slide.
All right, good evening, everyone. Stephanie touched upon some of our wildlife monitoring efforts that help create our wildlife inventory. I'm going to talk about the vegetation mapping and rare plant monitoring that helped us complete our plant inventory. In 2022, the Oceano Dunes District, with support from the Natural Resources Division, conducted standardized veg camp mapping of the OD-SVRA. This is a requirement of SB 249 and resulted in a fine-scale map and vegetation communities throughout the Oceano Dunes. VegCamp is short for Vegetation Classification and Mapping Program, which is administered by CDFW and implements standards that comply with the National Vegetation Classification System. Under the standard, vegetation communities within the district were mapped to a 1 acre minimum mapping unit. NAIP aerial imagery coupled with on-the-ground surveys were used to create a detailed map of vegetation communities within the park. Next slide. The most common vegetation community within the OD-SVRA is Silver Dune Lupin Mock Heather Shrubland Alliance, covering 1,230 acres, followed by the Dune Mat Herbaceous Alliance at 267 acres, and Arroyo Willow Thicket Shrubland Alliance at 217 acres. Approximately 47% of the land surface within the OD-SVRA was classified as bare sand. Next slide. The Oceano Dunes is home to a diverse assemblage of plants, including several rare and sensitive species. This includes 27 different California rare plant rank species, 4 of which are listed as federally endangered and 2 that are listed as state endangered, or excuse me, state threatened. District staff conduct annual surveys to monitor and ensure protection of these listed species. These surveys include population counts and distribution mapping. Next slide. I will now discuss the native planting program at the Oceano Dunes. The OD-SVRA has a long history of conducting native planting projects, including habitat restoration and also fugitive dust mitigation. Habitat restoration plantings have been installed within the park since 1986, and dust mitigation plantings have been implemented since 2013. A total of 41 acres of plantings are planned for this winter, which will include installation of approximately 120,000 native plants and 500 pounds of native seeds. Standard stabilization methods include application of rice straw, jute netting, and sterile grain seed to protect the plantings from sand movement. All native plantings and seeds used are sourced from within the Oceano Dunes to maintain local genetic integrity of the habitat. In order to complete projects of this scale, State Parks partners with our local Resource Conservation District, the Cal Poly Horticulture Program, California Conservation Corps, and American Conservation Experience to assist with seed collection, plant propagation, and field installation. Next slide, please. The second major component of our habitat restoration program is invasive species management. Invasive plant species, particularly European beachgrass, perennial belt grass, and ice plant, have inundated significant areas of the Oceano Dunes throughout historic introduction. Invasive plant species outcompete natives and modify the landscape to an unnatural state. The OD-SVRA employs both chemical treatment and manual removal of these species and has made significant gains in removing them from priority areas. And these include the vegetation islands, the fording south of Osoflaco Lake, and the northern non-riding area. Now I'll pass it back to Stephanie for chapter 3.
Okay, so we just got through chapter 2. Now we're going to talk about chapters 3, 4, and 5 together. I promise this will go quicker. These chapters outline the specific goals that we're trying to accomplish throughout the park. Next slide. So in developing these goals, we made sure they were consistent with the legislative requirements you've been hearing about this evening. Namely, our goals need to conserve and improve habitat. So we have goals with a conservation focus, and we have goals with an improvement focus. Each has its own specific objectives that are measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. In other words, we had to make sure we have the staffing power to realistically carry out this work in a timely way using protocols and data collection techniques that can help measure our work. So when it was all said and done, we identified 8 goals and objectives that you can read more about in the WIP. In the interest of time, we'll talk about 2 of them right now. I'll give an example of a conservation goal with the corresponding management and monitoring actions. And then Ben will do the same with one of our improvement goals. Next slide. So I talked about our management units earlier, and I said I'd come back to the Arroyo Grande Creek Management Unit. So our goal here is wildlife conservation. To get a little bit more specific, our objective is to achieve presence of tidewater goby and California red-legged frog, which are 2 federally listed species found within this management unit. And to get even more specific, our target here is to minimize impact to these species and their habitat through our monitoring and management actions. Next slide. Okay, so how does this all play out with the monitoring and management? We do annual surveys for both species at Arroyo Grande Creek and Lagoon using staff who are permitted by California and federal Fish and Wildlife. We've been monitoring tidewater goby, as I mentioned, on a quarterly basis for the past 20 years using special nets as seen below. And we've been surveying red-legged frog for the past 8 years. We go out at night and do eye shine surveys from the shoreline or by research vessel when the lagoon is too deep. Our monitoring efforts have consistently documented red-legged frog and tidewater goby within this management unit, which is why we implement management actions so that these species continue to stay protected. So some of these management actions include enforcing creek crossing guidelines. We only allow street legal vehicles to cross the creek, and they have to cross as close to the ocean as possible. And why is this? Because this is not an area where you find tidewater goby or California red-legged frog. They're found further up in the lagoon. Sometimes, though, the lagoon area does extend beyond the permanent vehicle closure when there's high tides that inundate the lagoon. This is, as you guys probably know, a very dynamic system. So we're constantly trying to adjust our posts and signage to keep those ponded areas closed. We also coordinate with willing landowners and water agencies to minimize upstream water quality and quantity effects. These are 2 factors that are outside of our control that can really limit our monitoring. We don't control water quality. We don't control the availability that we get. So we've had to do the best we can working within the constraints of the site and documenting when there are things that are outside of our control that may be impacting these species. Ultimately, though, by protecting Arroyo Grande Creek and Lagoon Management Unit, we can ensure these species and others persist, and we can continue to allow creek crossing because we've shown there's really little to no impacts to tidewater goby and red-legged frog. Okay, so that was my example. I'm going to pass it back to Ben. He's going to give his restoration goal example. Next slide.
Okay, Stephanie just gave an example of a wildlife conservation goal, and now I'll give an example of a restoration improvement goal, as she just said. Our overall goal here is to restore and improve habitat. To get more specific, we'll look at the objective, which is to reduce invasive plant cover. Our focus is on biltgrass, ice plant, and European beach grass. Our target is to prevent these three species from exceeding 1% cover within our vegetated islands. Next slide, please. Our goal here is to restore and improve habitat. This goal takes place in areas that are already closed. Under the WIP, we are not permanently closing more riding area. This goal solely focuses on improving existing habitat. For this example, our target is to prevent our top 3 invasive plant species from exceeding 1% cover. Thanks to detailed vegetation mapping and data that we've collected in the field, we are able to calculate the area of native and invasive vegetation. Each vegetation island is revisited annually, and new detections are documented and addressed promptly. Progress will be reevaluated through complete mapping and cover assessment of target species within the vegetated island at least every 5 years. In addition to prevent introduction of new invasive species, staff will conduct early detection and rapid response surveys. The management component includes treatment with herbicide or manual removal as appropriate for each species and site. Herbicide treatment is typically conducted annually by a licensed contractor. Hand removal is typically conducted around sensitive resource areas and conducted by park staff and other working crews. All right, back to Stephanie.
Okay, so we are wrapping up. The last chapter that we'll be talking about is chapter 6. This chapter covers how we evaluate and adapt after all the monitoring and management actions have been implemented. Next slide. So this graphic shows the adaptive management loop that basically covers the chapters we just talked about. All of the components of this loop inform each other. Starting with the upper right, the natural resource assessment. We started this presentation talking about the wildlife and plant inventories. As I mentioned, those inventories helped us identify our goals and objectives. The next part of the loop, we can't have goals without implementing management actions, and we don't know if the management actions are effective unless we monitor. The last part of the loop is how we evaluate and adapt based on the monitoring findings. So some of the management actions may need to be altered in the future to allow for better protection if our monitoring results are showing an impact. Some of our goals may need to change over time as we continue to update those wildlife and plant inventories. Some of our monitoring protocols might change to stay current with best available science. So this management loop is constantly in motion when implementing our WIP, and we're making adjustments and adapting as we go. Next slide. So I wanted to introduce you to the dedicated and talented resource staff we have at Oceano Dunes who help carry out this WIP. A lot of our staff are Cal Poly undergrad or master's students. Many have come from all over the United States because of the opportunities this park provides. We also work closely with our maintenance, law enforcement, interpretation, and admin team to make this WIP program so successful. I think a lot of us take pride knowing that our work is truly making a difference for the species and their habitats. And we've also worked really hard to stay compliant with the legislative requirements so that we can continue to allow for visitor use and enjoyment of the park. Like many of you on this call, we all really love this place too. Next slide. The revised WIP memorializes all the impactful work our park has been doing over the last 3 decades. This document will continue to be updated as needed, and every 5 years there will be a formal update with peer review. In the meantime, we'll be producing annual reports summarizing our findings. Next slide. So our WIP can be found online. A link was provided in the email invite. Public comment starts today, as Matthew mentioned, and ends December 22nd. Comments can be emailed to the address on the screen. I think it was also included in the invite. We anticipate finalizing the WIP by the end of the year. We're really excited to be wrapping this up, and we look forward to your feedback. With that concludes our presentation, and I'll give it back to Matthew.
Hey, thank you so much, Ronnie, Stephanie, Ben, all of you, for the great work you've done. And if I can have you guys make sure to stay on your cameras, because we're going to be now getting to the question and phase of this. So if anyone in the audience has any questions for the Oceano staff that we have here today about the WIP, please use the raise hand feature, and one of our park staff will call on you in the order that you guys raise your hands.
Matthew, while we're waiting for people to raise their hands, I think it's probably a good idea to remind everybody who wants, there will be a recording of this presentation that will be posted later this week. So in case you missed any of the slides or want to review some of the information from the presentation, there will be a recording made available. And I think you have the site where that's going to be in one of the slides.
Yeah, I don't believe it's in the slides, but I'll be sure to send it out via email once we got the recording uploaded to the website.
Excellent, thank you.
It looks like we have one person that has raised their hands, David Chipping. If you'd like to unmute your mic, you may ask your question.
And if anybody's have any issue with speaking, whether it's because of your mic or whatever, you're also free to post your question in chat, and one of our staff will read it out.
Looks like David, we can't hear you. If you can try unmuting your mic. If you can't, feel free to type into the chat your question and we can read it out for you.
So just a question for the technical team. Are we able to unmute Dave's mic?
No, we're only can allow him to unmute it himself. We can't actually unmute his mic.
Okay.
For him.
Yeah, David, if you have any technical difficulties, please go ahead and type it into chat and we'll happily read it out for you.
While David's figuring that out, if anybody else has a question, feel free to raise your hand or type it out in the chat.
Thank you, Shane. I was just about to say that as well.
Well, I'm a fan of awkward silence as much
Yeah.
as the next person. Let's see. It looks like we have a comment that just came in. So, will these slides be available to download is the question.
So we haven't done that before, but it's not something that is not a problem. We can certainly make them available to download alongside the recording if that is something people are interested in. So I will have them uploaded to the website alongside the video, and I'll send out an email once those have been done to the same group of people I sent out the email to this morning and a couple weeks ago. But yeah, since it doesn't seem like there are any other questions at the moment, I want to thank everybody for being here, and we look forward to receiving any comments you may have after reviewing the document. Please send them to the email address that you see on screen. It's the same email address that the invite got sent out from earlier today. And once again, thanks again to all three of our presenters from Oceano Dunes today. I really appreciate all the work that you guys have done, both in the WIP itself and on this presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's Sarah Miggins. I just wanted to also extend a big thank you for your presentations and your 30 years plus of service to Oceano Dunes. Great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Much appreciated.
With that will conclude our presentation for the evening. Thanks, everyone.